Right, Luke, I read this book to you years ago, so don't spoil it. And you have seen the film, so you should remember bits of it.
Okay.
Now, it's been a long time since I read to you. It's been over 9 weeks. It was the end of April when I last read to you. Now, in lockdown, I was hoping to read to you every day, but that didn't happen. We got distracted. But anyway, this one was recommended to me by two very famous academics, Penny Fielding and also Caroline McCracken-Flesher. And I asked them what good book, children's book, should I read to you? And this is it. Joan Aiken, The Wolves of Willoughby Chase. Now, a lot of things changed in the 9 weeks since I last read to you. Firstly, I've not had my hair cut, so I've got lots of hair. And secondly, I've started to go blind. I'm now needing glasses, though they're only 0.25. So, without further ado, let's read this book. Note, the action in this book takes place in a period of English history that never happened, shortly after the accession to the throne of good King James III in 1832. At this time, did he actually say that never happened? It did, yeah. At this time, the Channel Tunnel from Dover to Calais having recently been completed, a great many wolves, driven by severe winters, had migrated through the tunnel from Europe and Russia to the British Isles. It was dusk, winter dusk. Snow lay white and shining over the pleated hills, and icicles hung from the forest trees. Snow lay piled on the dark road across Willoughby Wold. But from dawn men had been clearing it with brooms and shovels. There were hundreds of them at work, wrapped in sacking because of the bitter cold, and keeping together in groups for fear of the wolves, grown savage and reckless from hunger. Snow lay thick, too, upon the roof of Willoughby Chase, the great house.
Where's Willoughby Chase?
It's a great house that stood on an open eminence in the heart of the wold. But for all that, the Chase looked an inviting home, a warm and welcoming stronghold. Its rosy herringbone brick was bright and well cared for. Its numerous turrets and battlements stood up sharp against the sky, and the crenellated balconies, corniced. Luke, you're the studying architects. What does crenellated mean?
Don't know.
Okay, Luke's going to come back to us on that one. Corniced with snow. Each held a golden square of window. The house was alight within, and the joyous hubbub of its activity contrasted with the sombre sighing of the wind and the hideous howling of the wolves without. In the nursery, a little girl was impatiently dancing up and down before the great window, 14 feet high, which faced out over the park and commanded the long black expanse of road. "Will she be here soon, Pattern? Will she?" She was continually crying. "We shall hear soon enough, I dare say, Miss Bonny," was the inevitable reply from her maid, who, on hands and knees in front of the fire, was folding and gophering the frills of 20 lace petticoats. The little girl turned again to her impatient vigil. She had climbed up onto the window seat, the better to survey the snowy park, and was jumping on its well-sprung cushions, covered in crimson satin. Each time she bounced, she nearly hit the ceiling. "Give over, Miss Bonny, do," said Pattern, after a while. "Look at the dust you're raising. I can hardly see my tongs. Come and sit by the fire. We shall hear soon enough when the train's due." Bonny left her perch reluctantly enough and came to sit by the fire. She was a slender creature, small for her age.
What's slender?
Thin, but rosy-cheeked, with a mass of tumbled black locks falling to her shoulders, and two brilliant blue eyes, equally ready to dance with laughter or flash with indignation. Her square chin also gave promise of a powerful and obstinate temper, not always perfectly controlled. But her mouth was sweet, and she could be very thoughtful on occasion, as now, when she sat gazing into the fire, piled high on its two carved alabaster wolfhounds. "I hope the train hasn't been delayed by wolves," she said presently. "Nonsense, Miss Bonny, dear. Don't worry your pretty head with thoughts like that," replied Patten. "You know the porters and station master have been practising with their muskets and fowling pieces all week." At that moment there was a commotion from downstairs, and Bonny turned, her face alight with expectancy. As the noise of dogs barking, men shouting, and the doorbell clanging continued, she flew recklessly along the huge expanse of nursery floor, gleaming and polished as glass, and down the main staircase to the entrance hall. Her impetuosity brought her in a heap to the feet of an immensely tall, thin lady, clad from neck to toe in a travelling dress of swathed grey twill with a stiff collar, dark glasses, and dull green-buttoned boots. Bonny's headlong rush nearly sent this person flying, and she recovered her balance with an exclamation of annoyance. Who is guilty of this unmanly interruption?" she said, setting her glasses once more upon her nose. "Can this hoydenish creature be my new pupil?" I beg your pardon," Bonny exclaimed, picking herself up. "So I should hope. Am I right in supposing that you are Miss Green? I am Miss Slycarp, your new governess, and I am also your fourth cousin once removed," the lady added
Once
haughtily.
removed?
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean?
Not sure, maybe it's a cousin on a different side of the family. We'll have to look it up. As if she found the removal hardly sufficient. "Oh," Bonny stammered. "I didn't know. That is, I thought you were not expected until tomorrow. I was looking for my cousin Sylvia, who is arriving this evening." "I'm aware of the fact," said Miss Slycarp. Miss Slycarp replied coldly. "But that does not excuse bad manners. Where, pray, is your courtesy?" Rather flustered, Bonny performed this formality with less than her usual grace. "Lessons in deportment, I see, will need priority on our timetable," Miss Slycarp remarked, and she turned to look after her disposition of her luggage. "You, sir, do not stand there smirking and dawdling, but see that my valises are carried at once to my apartment, and that my maid is immediately in attendance to help me." James, the footman, who had been exchanging grimaces with the butler over the fact that he had received no tip, at once sprang to attention and said, "Your maid, miss? Did you bring a maid with you?" "No, blockhead. The maid whom Lady Green will have appointed to wait on me." "Well, I suppose Miss Patten will be helping you," said James, scratching his head. And he shouldered one of the 9 walrus-hide portmanteaux and staggered off to the service stairs. "I will show you a way to your room," said Bonny eagerly, "and when you are ready I will take you to see Papa and Mamma. I hope we shall love each other," she continued, leading the way up the magnificent marble staircase and along the portrait gallery. "I shall have so much to show you, my collection of flint arrowheads and my semi-precious stones." Miss Slycarp thinned her lips disapprovingly, and Bonny, fearing that she had been forward, said no more of her pursuits.
What pursuit?
Well, things she likes. "Here is your apartment," she explained presently, opening a door and exhibiting a commodious set of rooms, cheerful with fires and furnished with elegant tastes in gilt and mahogany. And here is my maid Patton to help you. Miss Leichhardt drew down her brows at this, but acknowledged the remark by an inclination of her head. Patton was already kneeling at the dressing case and drawing out such articles as the governess might immediately need. I shall leave you then for a moment, said Bonny, preparing to go. She turned to add, shall I come back in half an hour? But was arrested by the sight of Miss Leichhardt snatching a heavy marble hairbrush from its rest and striking a savage blow at the maid, who were taking out a little case apparently containing letters and papers. Pray, wretch, who gave you permission to meddle with my letters? She cried. Bonny sprang back in an instant, all her violent temper roused, and she seized the brush from Miss Leichhardt's hand, hurling it recklessly through the plate glass window. She picked up a jug of warm water, which a housemaid had just brought, and dashed it full in the face of her new instructress. Miss Leichhardt reeled under the impact. Her bonnet came off. So did her grey hair, which apparently was a wig, leaving her bald, dripping and livid with rage. Oh dear, I am so sorry, said Bonny in consternation. I did not mean to do that. My temper is a dreadful fault. But you must not strike Patton. She is one of my best friends. Oh, Patton, help her. The maid assisted Miss Leichhardt to replace the damp wig and repair the damage done by the water, but her compressed lips and nostrils showed how little she relished the task. An angry red wheal was rising on her cheek where the brush had struck her. Go, said Miss Leichhardt to Bonny, pointing at the door. Bonny was glad to do so. Half an hour later, though, she returned, having done her best in the meantime to wrestle with her rebellious temper. Shall I escort you to Mamma and Papa now? She said, when the governess bade her enter. Miss Leichhardt had changed into another grey twill dress with a high white collar, and had laid aside her Murano travelling cloak. She permitted Bonny to lead her towards the apartment of her parents, having first locked up several drawers in which she had deposited papers and placed the keys in it's a French word here, chatelaine at her belt. Bonny, whose indignation never lasted long, danced ahead cheerfully enough, pointing out to her companion the oubliette where cousin Roger had slipped, the panel which concealed the secret staircase, the haunted portico, the priest's hole, and other features of her beloved home. Miss Leichhardt, however, as she followed, wore on her face an expression that boded little good towards her charge. At length they paused before a pair of doors grander than any they had yet passed, and Bonny inquired of the attendant who stood before them if her parents were within. The attendant inquired of her attendant who stood before them if her parents were within. Receiving an affirmative answer, she joyfully entered and, running towards an elegant-looking lady, and gentlemen who were seated on an ottoman near the fireplace, exclaimed, Papa, Mamma, such a surprise! Here is Miss Leichhardt, come a day earlier than expected. Miss Leichhardt advanced and made her salutations to her employers. I regret not having come up to London to make arrangements with you myself, said Sir Willoughby, bowing easily to her, but my good friend and man of business, Mr. Gripe, will have told you how much we are situated on the eve of a departure, with so much to attend to. I had been aware that we had a distant cousin, yourself, ma'am, living in London, and I entrusted Mr. Gripe with the task of seeking you out and asking whether you would be willing to undertake the care of my estates and my child while we were abroad. My only other relative, my sister Jane, is, as perhaps you know, too frail and elderly for such a responsibility. I hope you and Bonnie will get on together famously." Here Miss Slycarp, in a low and grating tone, told him the story of the hairbrush and the jug of water, omitting, however, her unprovoked assault in the first place on poor Patton. So Willoughby burst into laughter. "Did she do that, the minx? You hussy!" And he lovingly pinched his daughter's cheeks. "Girls will be girls, Miss Slycarp, and you must allow something for the natural high spirits and excitement attendant on your own arrival and the expected one of her own cousin. I shall look to you to instil, in time, a more ladylike deportment on our wild sprite." Lady Green, who was dark-haired and sad-eyed, and who looked very ill, here raised her voice wearily, and asked her husband if that were not a knock on the door. He called a summons impatiently, and the station-master entered, a black, dingy figure, twisting his cap in his hands. "The down train is signalled, squire," he said, after bobbing his head in reverence to each of the persons present in the room. "Is it your pleasure to let it proceed?" "Surely, surely," said Sir Willoughby. My little niece is aboard it. Let it approach with all speed." "How did you come from the station, my man?" "What? Let orders be given for Solly to drive you back in the chaise, with a suitable escort, of course. Then he can wait there and bring back Miss Sylvia at the same time." "Oh, thank you indeed, sir," said the man with heartfelt gratitude. "Bless your noble heart, it would have taken me a weary while to walk those 10 miles back, and it is freezing fast." "That's all right," said Sir Willoughby heartily. "Mustn't let Miss Sylvia die of cold on the train. Besides, the wolves might get you, and then the poor child would be held up on the train all night for want of the signal. Never do, eh? Well, Bonnie, what is it, miss?" "Oh, Papa," said Bonnie, who had been plucking at his sleeve. "May I go with Solly in the chaise to meet Sylvia? May I?" No indulgence should be permitted a child who has behaved as she has done," remarked Miss Slycarp. "Oh, come, Miss Slycarp, come, ma'am," said Sir Willoughby good-naturedly. "Young blood, you know. Besides, my Bonnie's as good a shot at a wolf as any of them. Run along then, miss, but wrap up snug. Remember, you'll be several hours on the road." "Oh, thank you, Papa. Goodbye, Mamma. Dear, goodbye, Miss Slycarp." And she fondly kissed her parents and ran from the room to find her warmest bonnet and pelisse, however you pronounce that. "Reckless, foolish indulgence," muttered the governess, directing after Bonnie a look of the purest spite. "But hey," exclaimed Sir Willoughby, recalled to memory of Miss Slycarp's presence by the sound, though he missed the sense of her words. "If the trains are only just signalled, how did you come then, ma'am? You can't have flown here, hey?" For the first time the governess showed signs of confusion. That is to say, a friend who was driving over from Blastburn kindly offered to bring me here with my baggage," she at length replied. A bell clanged through the apartment at that moment. "The dressing bell," said Sir Willoughby, looking at a handsome gold watch, slung on a chain across his ample waistcoat. "I apprehend, Miss Slycarp, that you are fatigued from your journey and will not wish to dine with us. A meal will be served in your own apartments." He inclined his head in a dignified gesture of dismissal, which the governess had no option but to obey. Chapter 2. 2 days before these events, a very different scene had been enacted far away in London, where Bonny's cousin Sylvia was being prepared for her journey. Sylvia was an orphan, both her parents having been carried off by a fever when she was only an infant. She lived with her Aunt Jane, who was now becoming very aged and frail, and had written to Sir Willoughby to suggest that he took on the care of the little girl. He had agreed at once to this proposal, for Sylvia, he knew, was delicate, and the country air would do her good. Besides, he welcomed the idea of her gentle companionship for his rather harum-scarum Bonny. Aunt Jane and Sylvia shared a room. No, go and get another one. Aunt Jane and Sylvia shared a room. Aunt Jane and Sylvia shared a room at the top of a house. It was in Park Lane, this being the only street in which Aunt Jane could consider living. Unfortunately, she was very poor. She could afford to rent only a tiny attic in such a genteel district. The room was divided into two by a very beautiful but old curtain of white Chinese brocade.
That's brocade.
It must be some kind of fabric, or it could be that panelling that can be concertinaed and closed and opened. But it does say curtain, so brocade must be a type of fabric. She and Sylvia each had half the room at night, Aunt Jane sleeping on the divan and Sylvia on the ottoman. During the day the curtain was drawn back and hung elegantly looped against the wall. They cooked their meals over the gas jet, which had baths in a large enamelled Chinese bowl, covered with dragons, an heirloom of Aunt Jane's. At other times, it stood on a little occasional table by the door and was used for visiting cards. They were making Sylvia's clothes. Aunt Jane, with tears running down her face, had taken down the white curtain, which would no longer be needed, and was cutting it up. Fortunately, it was large enough to afford material for several chemises, petticoats, pantalettes, dresses, and even a bonnet. Aunt Jane, mopping her eyes with a tiny shred of the material, murmured, "I do like to see a little girl dressed all in white." "I wish we didn't need to cut up your curtain, Auntie," said Sylvia, who hated to see her auntie so distressed. "When I'm 35 and come into my money, I shall buy you a whole set of white brocade curtains." "There's my angel," her aunt replied, embracing her. "But when
Auntie won't be alive then."
But when you are 35, I shall be 103. And she set to work making the tucks in a petticoat with thousands of tiny stitches. Sylvia sighed and bent her fair head over another, with stitches almost equally tiny. She was a little depressed, though she would not dream of saying so, at the idea of wearing nothing but white, especially at her cousin Bonny's, where everything was sure to be grand and handsome. "Now let me think," muttered Aunt Jane, sewing away like lightning. "What can we use to make you a travelling cloak?" She paused for a moment and glanced round the room at the lovingly tender pieces of Sheraton and Hepple-white furniture, the antimacassars, the Persian screen across the gas jet kitchen. The window curtains were too threadbare to use, and in any case one must have window curtains. Alicia recollected an old green velvet shawl which they sometimes used as an extra bed cover when it was very cold, and they slept together in the ottoman, or on the ottoman. "I can use my jet-trimmed mantle instead," she said, reassuring to Sylvia. "After all, one person cannot be as cold as two." By the day of departure, all the clothes had been finished. Nothing much could be done about Sylvia's shoes, which were deplorably shabby. But Aunt Jane blacked them with a mixture of soot and candle grease, and Sylvia's bonnet was trimmed with a white plume from the ostrich feather fan which her aunt had carried at her coming out ball. All Sylvia's belongings were neatly packed into an old carpet bag, and Aunt Jane had made her up a little packet of provisions for the journey, though with strict injunctions not to eat them if there were anyone else in the compartment. For ladies never eat in public. That's what her aunt said. They were too poor to take a hackneyed carriage to the station, and Aunt Jane always refused to travel in omnibuses. That's the proper name for a bus, an omnibus. So they walked, carrying the bag between them. Fortunately, the station was not far, nor the bag heavy. Aunt Jane secured a corner seat for her charge and put her under the care of the guard. "Now remember, my dear child," she said, kissing Sylvia, and looking suspiciously round the empty compartment. "Never speak to strangers. Tip all the servants immediately. I have put all the farthings from my reticule at the bottom of your valise. Do not model yourself on your cousin Bonnie, who I believe is a dear good child but a little wild. Give my fond regards to my brother Willoughby, and tell him that I am in the pink of health and amply provided for. And if anyone except the guard speaks to you, pull the communication cord."
What's that?
It's on the train. It might be to stop the train, actually. "Yes, Auntie," replied Sylvia dutifully, embracing her. She felt a pang as she saw the frail old figure struggling away through the crowd, and wondered how her Aunt Jane would manage that evening without her little niece to adjust her curl papers and read aloud a passage of Dr. Johnson's dictionary. Then all Sylvia's fears were aroused, for a strange man entered the compartment and sat down. He did not speak, however, and took no notice of her, and the train shortly afterwards departing, her thoughts were diverted into a less apprehensive vein as she watched the unfamiliar houses with their lighted windows flying past. It was to be a long journey, a night and a day. The hour of departing was 6 o'clock in the evening, and Sylvia knew that she did not arrive at her destination until about 8 of the following evening. What strange forests, towns, mountains and stretches of countryside they would not have passed by then. As the train proceeded at its steady 15 miles an hour.
I can't eat until someone leaves, like you can't.
Apparently.
15 miles an hour.
She had never been out of London before, and watched eagerly from her window until they had left the houses behind, and she was driven to study the toes on her own shoes, so lovingly polished by Aunt Jane. The thought of the old lady, carefully preparing for her solitary slumbers, was too much for Sylvia, and tears began to run silently down her cheeks, which she endeavoured to mop with her tiny handkerchief, made from a spare 2 inches of white brocade. "This won't do," said a voice in her ear suddenly, and she looked up in alarm to see that the man at the other end of the compartment had moved along and was sitting opposite and staring at her. Sylvia gave her eyes a final dab and haughtily concentrated on a reflection in the dark window, but her heart was racing. Should she pull the communication cord? She stole a cautious glance at the man's reflection and saw that he was standing up, apparently extracting something from a large leather portmanteau. Then he turned towards her, holding something out. She looked round enough to see that it was a box of chocolates about a foot square by 6 inches deep, swathed around with violet ribbons. "No, thank you," said Sylvia, in as ladylike a tone as she could muster. "I never touch chocolate." All the same, she had to swallow rapidly a couple of times, for tea which she had shared with Aunt Jane before the journey, although very refined, had not been substantial. 2 pieces of thin bread and butter, a cinnamon wafer, and a sliver of caraway cake. She knew better, however, than to accept food from strangers, and as to open her own little packet while she was in the carriage. That was out of the question. She shook her head again. "Now, come along, do," said the man coaxingly. "All little girl likes sweeties, I know." "Sir," said Sylvia coldly, "if you speak to me again, I shall be obliged to pull the communication cord." He sighed and put away the box. Her relief over, this was premature, however, for he turned round next minute with a confectioner's pasteboard carton filled with every imaginable variety of little cakes. There were jam tarts, maids of honour, lemon cheesecakes, Chelsea buns, and numerous little ice confections in brilliant and enticing colours. "I always put up a bit of tiffin for a journey," he murmured as if to himself, and placing the box on the seat directly opposite Sylvia, he selected a cake covered with violet icing and bit into it. It appeared to be filled with jam. Sylvia looked straight ahead and ignored him, but again she had to swallow. "Now, my dear, how about one of these little odds and ends?" said the man. I can't possibly eat them all by myself, can I?" Sylvia stood up and looked for the communication cord. It was out of her reach. "Shall I pull it for you?" inquired her fellow traveller politely, following the direction of her eyes upwards. Sylvia did not reply to him. She did not feel, though, that it would be ladylike to climb up on the seat or armrest to pull the cord herself, so she sat down again, biting her lip with anxiety. To her inexpressible relief, the stranger, after eating 3 or 4 more cakes with every appearance of enjoyment, put the box back in his portmanteau, wrapped himself in a richly furred cloak, retired to his own corner and shut his eyes. A subdued but regular snore soon issuing from his partly open mouth presently convinced Sylvia that he was asleep, and she began to breathe more freely. At length she brought out from concealment under her mantle her most treasured possession, and held it lovingly in her arms. This was a doll named Annabella, made of wood, not much larger than a candle, and plainly dressed, but extremely dear to Sylvia. She and Annabella had no secrets from one another, and it was a great comfort to her to have this companion as the train rocked on through the unfamiliar dark. Presently she grew drowsy and fell into uneasy slumber, but not for long. It was bitterly cold, and her feet in their thin shoes felt like lumps of ice. She huddled into her corner and wrapped herself in the green cloak, envying her companion his thick furs and undisturbed repose, and wishing it were ladylike to curl her feet up beneath her on the seat. Unfortunately, she knew better than that. She dreamed, without being really asleep, of Arctic seas, of monstrous tunnels through hillsides fringed with icicles. Her travelling companion, who had grown a long tail and a pair of horns, offered her cakes the size of grand pianos and coloured scarlet, blue and green. When she bit into them, she found they were made of snow. She woke suddenly from one of these dreams to find that the train had stopped with a jerk. "Oh, what is it? Where are we?" she exclaimed before she could stop herself. "No need to alarm yourself, miss," said her companion, looking unavailingly out of the black square of window. "Wolves on the line, most likely. They often have trouble of that kind hereabouts." "Wolves?" Sylvia stared at him in terror. "They don't often get into the train, though," he added reassuringly. 2 years ago they managed to climb into the guard's van and eat a pig, and once they got the engine driver. Another had to be sent in a relief engine, but they don't often eat a passenger, I promise you." As if in contradiction of his words, a sad and sinister howling now arose beyond the windows, and Sylvia, pressing her face against the dark pane, saw that they were passing through a thickly wooded region where snow lay deep on the ground. Across this white carpet she could just discern a ragged multitude pouring, out of which arose from time to time this terrible cry. She was almost petrified with fear and sat clutching Annabella in a cold and trembling hand. At length she summoned up strength to whisper, "Why don't we go on?" "Oh, I expect there are too many of them on the line ahead," the man answered carelessly. "Can't just push through them, you see. The engine would be derailed in no time, and then we should be in a bad way. No, I expect we'll have to wait here till daylight now. The wolves get scared then, you know, and make for home. All that matters is that the driver shan't get eaten in the meantime. He'll keep them off by throwing lumps of coal at them, if I dare say." "Oh," Sylvia exclaimed in irrepressible alarm as a heavy body thudded suddenly against the window, and she had a momentary view of a pointed grey head, red slavering jaws and pale eyes gleaming with ferocity. "Oh, don't worry about that," soothed her companion. "They'll keep up that jumping against the window for hours. They're not much danger, you know, singly. It's only in the whole pack you've got to watch out for them." Sylvia was not much comforted by this. She moved along to the middle of the seat and huddled there, glancing fearfully, first to one side and then to the other. The strange man seemed quite undisturbed by the repeated onslaught of the wolves which followed. He took a pinch of snuff, remarked that it was all a great nuisance and they would be late, and composed himself to sleep again. He had just begun to snore when a discomposing incident occurred. The window beside him, which must have been insecurely fastened, was not proof against the continuous impact of the frenzied and ravenous animals. The catch suddenly slipped, and the window fell open with a crash, its glass shivering into fragments. Sylvia screamed. Another instant, and the wolf precipitated itself through the aperture thus formed. It turned, snarling on the sleeping stranger, who started awake with an oath, and very adroitly flung his cloak over the animal. He then seized one of the shattered pieces of glass lying on the floor and stabbed the imprisoned beast through the cloak, it fell dead. "Tush," said Sylvia's companion, breathing heavily and passing his hand over his face.
What does touch mean?
Be quiet. Unexpected, most. He extracted the dead wolf from the folds of the cloak and tipped its body with some exertion out through the broken window. And there's the picture. There was a chorus of snarling and yelping outside, and then the wolves seemed to take fright at the appearance of their dead comrade, for Sylvia saw them coursing away over the snow. "Come, that's capital," said the man. "We better shift before they come back." "Shift? Into another compartment," he explained. "Can't stay in this one now. Too cold for one thing, and for another, have wolves popping in the whole time. Nuisance. No, come along. Now's the time to do it." Sylvia was most reluctant, and indeed most too terrified to accompany him, but she saw the force of his proposal and watched anxiously as he opened the door and glanced this way and that. "Right, just pass me out those bags, will you?" He placed both hands and hers ready on the seat. She passed them out, holding them in one hand. He made his way sideways along the footboard to the next carriage door, which he opened. He tossed in the bags, returned for his cloak and rug, and finally reappeared and held out his hand to Sylvia. "Come along now, my dear, if you don't want to be made into wolf porridge," he exclaimed with frightening joviality, and Sylvia timorously permitted him to assist her along the narrow ledge and into the next carriage. It was with a sense of unbounded relief and thankfulness that she heard him slam the door and make sure that the windows were securely fastened. "Excellent," he remarked with a smile at Sylvia, which bared every tooth in his head. "Now can we have another 40 winks?" And he wrapped himself up again in his cloak, careless of any wolf gore that might remain in its folds, and shut his eyes. Sylvia was too cold and terrified to sleep. She crouched as before in the middle of the seat, icy, shivering, and expecting at any minute to hear the wolves recommence their attack against the window. "Here, we can't have this," said a disapproving voice, as she turned to see the man awaking again and scrutinising her closely. "Not warm enough, eh? Here." And then he saw her face wince away from his cloak. He unstrapped a warm-plaid travelling rug and insisted on wrapping her in it. Tired, frozen and frightened, Sylvia wasn't able to resist him any longer. "Put your feet up and lie down," he ordered. "That's right. Now shut your eyes. No more wolves for the time being. They've been scared away. Off to sleep with you." Sylvia was beginning to be deliciously warm. Her last recollection was of hearing his snores begin again.